all of these international regulatory institutions arise really to try and solve specific and quite often important problems. Well, thank you for that introduction. Perhaps I should just better mention at the beginning, I'm not sure whether it says in my biography that I work as Director of Policy and Research at the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales, but that is one of my jobs. But just to say that nothing I say necessarily reflects the view of the Bishops' Conference or indeed any bishops. So I should just put that on record just in case. In England, we call this slot immediately after lunch the graveyard slot, because all the students have lunch and then they come along and they fall asleep in the lecture, which is immediately after lunch, of course. I've just had a cup of coffee, so I'm fine. I shall stay awake, and I hope that you'll be able to stay awake as well. This is an interesting topic for me because I don't know that much more about the topic than what I'm going to tell you today. But what I think I can provide is some insights and some relationships between these, actually a group of topics that I'm going to talk about, and other disciplines such as economics, political economy, possibly even Catholic social teaching as well. So I'm going to tell you what I know and that hopefully open up quite a few avenues for discussion. In particular, maybe related to the future of the European Union. Not that there's much chance of the European Union changing in any significant sense how it operates. So, global governance and regulation. There's at least 2 or 3 parts to this talk. The first part will really be focusing on global governance, by which I mean literally the whole world. And the second part will be talking more about structures of regulation in the international economy, which don't necessarily include all the countries in the world, but are in some respect international. Now, just to say that international governance is not new. We've had international governance for thousands of years. Generally, it was done by empires. So the British Empire governed about 25% of the landmass of the world, probably the biggest empire that ever existed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire governed a large part of Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century. And the Roman Empire, of course, governed most of what was the then known world. Now, we can debate whether those empires provided governance or oppression. Probably it was a mixture of both and a different combination in the case of different empires. Certainly some empires were simply tools of oppression, but many were also, at least to an extent, tools of international governance as well. More benignly, and indeed I would say actually more positively, during the medieval period, the Hanseatic League evolved as a collaboration of city-states that facilitated free trade and commerce more generally. And the League was a kind of early single market, but it evolved from the bottom up. There was a common commercial legal system, and it stretched from the edge of the UK, not all of the UK, but the edge of the UK to Portugal, to Venice and Russia, and actually incorporated some large German cities as well. It didn't have a strong and permanent administrative authority, and actually this is quite important, and I think it's one of the reasons why it was so successful and enabled in many ways economic freedom and commerce to flourish. It evolved naturally rather than by force from the top down. It was certainly not a form of global governance as such, but it was a form of international governance of commerce. Today we do have formally constituted institutions of international governance and regulation, and indeed some formal institutions of global governance as well. But these aren't of one variety. There are many different ways in which these manifest themselves. To give some examples, you have the United Nations, you have the European Union, which I've mentioned, you have the World Trade Organization. I'll talk later about organizations involved in international regulation of finance. And then you have some other smaller confederations of nations, such as the Convention on the Protection of the Rhine, which involve a small number of countries which come together for a particular purpose. And all of these institutions, all of these global governance, all of these international regulatory institutions arise really to try and solve specific and quite often important problems. So firstly, though, the question, let's think of the question of why we should have international institutions of governance at all. And in particular, why we should have a global institution of governance. The United Nations is the example I will use. And this is just a particular example of a question that economists, political economists, and political scientists often ask. Why should different things be done at different levels of government? In Germany, it would be strange if you had the federal government deciding where park benches or street lights went, and then the town governments having each their own armies. There is a reason why the federal government has responsibility for defence, and the smaller levels of government have responsibility for doing the more local things. So why might there be some particular functions which you decide should operate at the level of the whole world, or more generally internationally? But I'm going to start with the whole world. And the first justification really for international governance, and global governance in particular, comes from the realization that all human persons are endowed with particular rights and should enjoy specific freedoms. The right to life, the right to not have property expropriated, freedom of religion, the right not to be unjustly imprisoned, to not be tortured, the right to live in peace, and so on. And this question was probably first considered in the modern era by a group of Spanish theologians known as the late Scholastics, or School of Salamanca, more or less Iberian Spanish and Portuguese. And they considered moral problems which were arising from the expansion of the Spanish Empire into the Americas. And actually they were responding to moral questions that they were asked in the confessional, by and large, by maybe important people who were taking important decisions. And that led them to consider the sort of theoretical aspects, if you like, of these practical problems. And one particular question that people were thinking about, we're talking here the 16th century really, is the question of whether the Spanish Empire had the right to take slaves or make slaves of the South American people. So the late scholastics considered this question, and their considerations really led to the first, if you like, modern exposition of the idea of universal human rights. So Bartolomé de las Casas, for example, he thought about this and he concluded all the peoples of the world are humans, and there is only one definition of all humans and of each one, that is that they are rational, thus all the races of humankind are one. And that was a statement that he was making really to attack the idea that it was okay for the Spanish Empire to take slaves in South and Central America. And of course it has wider implications. And a fellow late scholastic scholar, Vittoria, then expanded this idea to consideration of the question of international law. And whether international law should move from being what at that time were basically temporary treaties to being actually a systematic, universal world order. And Vittoria suggested, in the gravest matters, it is not permissible for one country to refuse to be bound by international law, the latter having been established by the authority of the whole world. And as far as Vittoria were concerned, this international law should be enforcing human rights, and specifically he talked about the rights to travel, the rights to rest in any country you wish, the rights to trade in foreign lands. And actually these are, in a sense, the three pillars of what we might describe as contemporary globalization: the right to migrate, the right to trade, and also with globalization as well, the right to move capital. They're also the freedoms protected by the European Union as well. And he added to these the right to preach the gospel, in other words, free speech, freedom of conscience reflected in free speech, the right to protect the baptized, and the right to dispose of a tyrannical ruler. And you can see in these statements by Vittoria, if you like, the modern beginnings of thinking which would lead naturally, in some senses, to the establishment of an institution of world governance, the purpose of which was to try to protect fundamental human rights. Now, I should say that Vittoria's justifications were specifically Christian, and as you can tell from one of the rights being the right to protect the baptized, didn't expand that to others, their application was intended in a way which presupposed a Christian inspired government. But those sorts of ideas were then later absorbed into the thinking of Enlightenment thinkers. So there became really a wide-ranging consensus that there are some things that we all ought to be able to do without interference from government, and that somehow these rights should be protected by a power which, if you like, is greater than the power of a national government. So it's, in a sense, out of this way of thinking that we end up with the United Nations, which I'm going to critique in a few moments as well. So the United Nations exists to undertake functions such as peacekeeping. It's not always successful, but it's not always unsuccessful either. So it goes into areas where there are human rights are under threat from war and tries to keep peace between the nations who are at war. Does the same in areas where there's internal civil conflict as well. And then the United Nations has its Charter of Human Rights, in which you can see it mirroring in some senses the kind of things that De las Casas and Vittoria were discussing. So the Charter of Human Rights begins by noting that every human person is born free, equal in dignity and rights, and endowed with reason and conscience, and that this charter should protect that. And that's all well and good. So there are, for example, in the charter, requirements that governments restrain from oppressing people, torturing people, and their rights to property are expressed, and this type of thing. And that works quite well, I think, as a relatively limited agenda for a global institution. It may be very difficult, as we'll see in a moment, for that global institution to actually effectively ensure that those rights are maintained, but in principle that works quite well, I think. A bit more problematic is that the UN Charter of Human Rights then carries on and talks about how people have a right to housing, positive rights, you might call these, and paid holidays, and this type of thing. And this is a slightly odd agenda because it raises the question, how can a global, an institution of global governance possibly ensure that the people of, let's say, the Ivory Coast all manage to have a paid holiday every year? And in fact, 25% of the world's population are subsistence farmers. The concept of a paid holiday really doesn't make any sense at all. It's a rather Western imposition in some senses. But even if that were not the case, it's not clear how an institution of global governance could enforce positive rights. So I'll talk about this maybe a little more later, but I would basically scrub these positive rights from the agenda of any institution of global governance. And another reason for doing that is that it prevents, by limiting the agenda of an institution of global governance, you prevent mission creep, which is something I'll talk about also a bit later. Now, the United Nations has various mechanisms to try to enforce these rights, and they include the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. Again, I'll talk about those a little bit later. Rather like peacekeeping, they kind of work sometimes, but you wouldn't expect, for reasons, again, I'll address in a few seconds, you wouldn't expect them to be able to have the same effectiveness as a criminal court in an individual nation state. So there's and the reason for that is because there's a paradox really at the heart of international governance. And in a sense, this paradox was foreshadowed by Vittoria's vision that this institution of global, enabling global human rights that operated on a worldwide basis would be operating in an environment in which all countries in the world had a Christian culture. But what happens if you have a situation whereby significant countries in the world simply don't enforce, don't permit, and indeed abuse those fundamental human rights that the United Nations is set up to promote? So the idea is that the rights are fundamental, so fundamental that they must be enforced worldwide. If all the countries in the world agreed to these rights being enforced, they'd do it themselves. You wouldn't need a global institution. If, on the other hand, significant countries themselves abuse human rights, what is a global institution going to do about it? The problem is that the United Nations and any other institution you might envisage is never realistically going to have a power that transcends that of nation states. In other words, it can have this agenda, but if in a major country, it may work when human rights are abused in smaller countries, but if in a major country human rights are systematically abused, what's the United Nations going to do? It can't really do anything because it can only operate with the permission, essentially, of the states which are member nations. And in particular, any substantial action by the United Nations requires unanimity on what's called the Security Council of the United Nations, and that Security Council includes China, France, Russia, the UK, and the United States. And immediately, you might see how that might create problems. These questions which I pose here are really rhetorical questions. You don't even need to ask these questions. Why has the UN not intervened in the Ukraine? Well, because Russia would veto any action. China would either abstain or veto too. Would the UN intervene if China invaded Taiwan? No, because China would veto any such action. Has the UN intervened regarding the incarceration of 1 million Uyghurs in China? No, it hasn't, because China always vetoes any proposed action. And in fact, when the UN High Commissioner visited the region of China where the Uyghurs live back in May, her report was such that it actually reflected back the Chinese government's own language. It said, in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, I've raised questions and concerns about the application of counter-terrorism and de-radicalization measures. They're precisely the words the Chinese government use to justify their incarceration and so-called re-education. In fact, it's surprising she didn't say re-education, perhaps. And their broad application, particularly their impact on the rights of Uyghurs and other predominantly Muslim minorities. It is just worth mentioning that she produced a new report just before she retired 2 weeks ago, and that was a little bit stronger. Not much stronger, but a little bit stronger than this risible one that was produced back in May. As I mentioned before, the United Nations has these two courts, the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, by which it is supposed to enforce the international law for which it's responsible, but any permanent member of the Security Council can also veto the International Court of Justice decisions. This table here shows the countries ranked by an index of press freedom, which is, there are lots of these indices about measuring different dimensions of political, economic, social freedoms and so on. And this particular one measures press freedom. And the lower the score, the better. If you have a score of 0, it means the press is entirely free from any government control whatsoever. A score of 100 essentially would mean that the state controlled entirely all aspects of news, media, online media, and so on. And I've stuck Austria here just for comparison, but and also North Korea, because I think North Korea is the country which is ranked worst. That's also there for comparison. But what is interesting is that Russia scores 48.7 on that index. And we know now from there being so much coverage of the war in Ukraine how little press freedom there is in Russia. And I've just picked a number of states which have a less free press than Russia and added up their populations. This isn't all the states. There'll be a lot of smaller ones as well. This isn't all the states that have a less free press than Russia. But if you just look at these big countries that have a less free press than Russia and add up their populations is almost exactly equal to half the population of the world. In other words, half the population of the world live in countries where the press is less free than the press in Russia. So, I think that just reinforces the point that it's extremely difficult, realistically, to create an institution of global governance which will be effective, really effective, at enforcing basic human rights, freedom from torture, oppression, free speech is amongst those rights, of course, peace, freedom to own property, and so on, when the vast majority of the United Nations members don't even have those policies domestically. Now, unless the UN was an entirely independent institution with its own army, and that would then lead to the question of to whom is it accountable, then the only levers it can use are with permission of its members. But in many of its member states, we don't have the basics of economic, social, and political freedom. So just to oh no, there's another point first about capture by its bureaucracy. So you have, I mentioned at the beginning, this organization of global governance, which, in my view, could usefully have a limited number of powers to try to enforce as best it can, despite all the problems I've talked about, basic human rights around the world. You'd expect such an institution to be relatively small. Its functions are quite limited. But no, of course, there is a huge principal agent problem when it comes to the United Nations, because unlike, there's a big enough principal agent problem when it comes to domestic governments, but unlike domestic governments, nobody elects the United Nations. It's supposed to act on behalf of the population of the world as a whole, all 8 billion of us, but we really have no practical say in how it operates. So effectively, the United Nations bureaucracy becomes accountable to itself rather than being accountable to the people it's supposed to serve, the people of the whole world, in terms of implementing basic human rights. And the United Nations today employs 110,000 people on a $10 billion budget. And the World Health Organization, as you're probably aware, pretty much failed, partly because of its links with China in the COVID crisis. It was very, very late out of the starting blocks in terms of trying to address the COVID crisis. And the World Health Organization, which I should say is an offshoot of the United Nations, has a budget itself of $3.8 billion. The wife of the Chinese president is a World Health Organization goodwill ambassador, and the current Director General of the World Health Organization tried to appoint Robert Mugabe as a World Health Organization goodwill ambassador. It also promotes a universal right to abortion, despite that being no part at all of actual United Nations resolutions on the subject. So this is the problem with any government organisation. No, even local government can be captured by town hall bureaucrats. But if you have an institution of global governance, then of course the ensuring that its administrators and its bureaucracy are accountable to the people it's supposed to serve is really more or less impossible. And as a result, it begins to have a life of its own. And just to give you another example of this mission creep, the United Nations, this body which is supposed to stop people being tortured, etc., decided to send a extremely left-wing academic who I think has a position at the UN. Some have described him as a Marxist, I believe. Professor Alston, to the United Kingdom on a special mission to look into the problem of poverty in the United Kingdom. This is obviously related to, if you like, the positive rights which are in the UN Charter. And he concluded his report by saying some observers might conclude, he was only there for 14 days, might conclude that the Department for Work and Pensions, it's the UK government department which looks after welfare, had been tasked with designing a digital and sanitised version of the 19th century workhouse made infamous by Charles Dickens. So here is a real-life picture of a 19th century workhouse, as described by Charles Dickens. There are several children in each of these beds, and there's David Alston actually during his visit collecting the evidence from the poor of the 21st century. There really is a substantial difference, I think, between the two. And this sort of thing is just no part of the UN's business at all. But the bureaucracy of the UN just decides to expand its mission in order to pursue a particular political agenda. He produced a 21-page report with 14 recommendations, all of which have been put straight into the waste paper basket, thank goodness. So let's have some tentative conclusions about the United Nations. On balance, I would prefer it to exist than not exist. I mean, I just don't think it can do a totally good and comprehensive job. It's just not possible. But I'd rather have an organisation that might do some good in some circumstances than not have an organisation like the UN at all. I do think that the major funders of the UN, and actually 4 countries, China, Germany, the United States, and I can't remember the 4th, I'll check in a second, should take responsibility, in fact, I think, to stop the mission creep. If major funders started withdrawing their funding and reducing the UN's budget, it could have a significant influence. And then we should limit the functions of the United Nations to, it's Japan is the 4th country. We should then limit the functions of the United Nations to ensure that it just deals with these very basic human rights and their enforcement as best it can in an international environment, which is pretty messy, it has to be said. Okay, so that's the United Nations. And I want to move on to talk about other forms of international regulation. So I'd start this by saying that I think a global, or rather, a global governance or a global regulatory institution should only exist to fulfill the most basic and minimal functions. For more extensive functions, it's important to have bodies which operate on a more regional level or only incorporating some countries that have a common interest. And we've got lots of international organizations that go way beyond the functions of the United Nations. And there are all sorts of reasons why we have them. They're quite complicated economic justifications, quite complicated to explain at times. One of the reasons which is put forward relates to the transactions costs, as economists describe them, of dealing with multiple regulatory systems. So imagine in Germany if banks were regulated in a different way in every town and city. It would be extremely expensive to develop a national banking network. Well, people use the same justification at an international level. Wouldn't it be good if all countries had the same regulation, and then countries can trade financial services much more easily without the costs of dealing with different regulatory systems? And the same applies to other things, not just banking and financial services. And we've had international financial regulation for quite some time. And interestingly, following the financial crisis, there were calls from lots of quarters to develop a global regulatory system for finance. So this is a statement from the World Economic Forum. While it is the right time to review the effectiveness of the regulatory reforms of the past decade, it remains important that any ongoing and future work is done in a globally coordinated way. And there are lots of statements like that from the WEF and elsewhere, the EU too. This is the Vatican. In fact, one can see an emerging requirement for a body that will carry out the functions of a kind of central world bank that regulates the flow and system of monetary exchanges, as do national central banks, and more generally then call for more global regulation of banking. And it's done that in a few documents. Some cynical people, including some conservative sort of Trumpite, if you like, Catholics in the United States, say there's a kind of pact between the current Pope and the World Economic Forum to impose global governance on us all. I just don't think that's just not right at all. I'm not that cynical, and there's no justification for those kinds of accusations. But it has to be said, I am somewhat skeptical of taking the system of international financial regulation further than already exists, for a lot of really quite good reasons. And to begin with, these calls for more international financial regulation and more international banking regulation come at a rather odd time. So they came following the financial crisis, but actually, at the time of the financial crisis, we'd had global, or international rather, regulation of the banking system or other bits of the financial system for a long time. So from 1988, we'd had the Bank for International Settlements Basel Accord for regulating banks. And all countries, more or less, I think all countries which suffered greatly from the financial crisis were signed up to that accord. We've got international accounting standards. The International Organization of Securities Commissions, I think IOSCAs, the European Supervisory and Markets Authority, the Markets in Financial Instruments and Derivatives Directive, I think that one is. Now, whatever combination of 3 letters or 4 letters you randomly draw from the alphabet, it will make up the acronym of some kind of financial regulatory body, treaty, or directive of the European Union. And the thing is here that the international banking regulation, in fact, many would argue, made the crash more likely and exacerbated its effects. So instead of actually looking at the really significant levels of international financial regulation that we already had and asking whether these caused harm in the financial crisis, these global bodies stood back and said, we had a huge problem with the financial crisis. The solution is to give the global bodies, give ourselves more power in order to regulate financial markets. So what are the problems of international financial regulation? Well, first of all, it leads to complexity very quickly. So German banks are very different, for example, from British banks. And a regulatory system which is designed to regulate both of them in the same way, together, is necessarily more complicated than a regulatory system that's separate for German banks and for British banks. If you put the other, whatever it is, 20 or 30 countries which are in the Basel Code in the single regulatory system, it just gets more and more complicated as the number of countries becomes greater. So the first Basel Accord in 1988, for example, was 30 pages long. The regulatory framework was 30 pages long. The third Basel Accord, just after the financial crisis, was 616 pages long. And this leads to several problems. Complexity begets complexity. So, and soon regulation becomes so complex that it's only possible for the regulators to understand it or the regulated institutions to understand the regulation. It's not possible for academics like me or democratically elected people, your politicians, to understand the regulatory system and then hold the regulators to account. And this is a huge problem when it comes to financial regulation. I used to be something of an expert in insurance regulation, and which has a long history in the UK, and used to be really simple. And then we came to adopt, and in fact the UK kind of imposed it on the rest of the EU, this framework called Solvency II for regulating insurance companies, which was just thousands and thousands of paragraphs long. In fact, I once found a tiny subsection in relation to the total, which where the list of typographical errors that the European Union published was actually longer than the 1870s Insurance Companies Act, which governed UK insurance, which regulated UK insurance companies for 100 years. So the whole regulatory process then becomes captured by consultants. It becomes captured by the regulated companies who see high levels of regulation as a way to impose higher costs on potential entrants into the market and therefore create barriers to entry and reduce competition. And it becomes captured by government bureaucracies, and they're the only people who understand it. And you can't hold these people to account in any realistic way. So that's the second problem with international financial regulation. Regulators get things wrong. Regulators they're not especially stupid, but they're also not uniquely omniscient either. So we can't expect any regulatory body to actually determine in advance what the best and most appropriate way of regulating any particular economic sector is, whether it's banking, insurance, brewing, pharmaceuticals, or anything else. And at least if regulation is done at a more local level, you can have experimentation. Different countries will choose different approaches to regulation. Countries can see what works best elsewhere and copy that. But if you have a single regulatory system and the wrong rules are chosen, then it could have quite serious effects. So in the financial crisis, for example, the Basel approach to regulating international banks, which most countries adopted, encouraged banks to securitize their loans and make their balance sheets much more opaque and complex. And this was, I won't say necessarily at the root of the crash, I wouldn't even say it caused the crash, but it certainly exacerbated the effects of the financial crisis. These rules were poorly designed, but because they were being operated on an international scale, it meant these poorly designed rules were adopted everywhere. So it meant that when banks went wrong in one country, then they were likely to go wrong in another country at the same time. So instead of having the crash being an isolated incident, it became an international financial phenomenon. And the Yale law academic Roberta Romano has summed this up quite well. She said, recent experience suggests that regulatory harmonization can increase rather than decrease systemic risk, the risk of the whole system failing at once, by incentivizing financial institutions worldwide to follow broadly similar business strategies. Regulatory error contributed to a global financial crisis. Yeah, this is another point as well, that if regulation is the same everywhere in the world, instead of having banks doing different things in different parts of the world, they'll all tend to do things in much more similar ways. And if one goes wrong, the whole lot are more likely to go wrong. Now, I don't think international regulation of any type, actually, is necessarily a bad thing. One of the things about international financial regulation is it does evolve from the bottom up. No country is forced to join the Basel Accord. No country is forced to adopt international accounting standards. They've all adopted these by consensus. And in a sense, that's the way it should be. I think that's the way international financial regulation ought to be. But that doesn't mean to say that everything they choose to do is necessarily right. Now, a second justification for global regulation is to solve what's known as collective action problems. And the most obvious collective action problem that we face today is probably that related to carbon emissions and climate change. And so regularly, countries globally meet at once a year. The next one is in November in Egypt. The last one was in Glasgow in the UK. Countries meet once a year at the so-called Conference of the Parties to talk about how they're going to reduce emissions and try to keep global warming down to manageable levels. And the idea here is that every country might be quite keen to reduce carbon emissions because of the beneficial effect of doing so, but every country individually only has a small impact on global emissions. So no country is going to reduce its carbon emissions unless every other country agrees to do so. So you bring out all the countries together and try and get a global agreement. Every country will act as long as every other country will act. But then there's a question of how you enforce this global agreement. So lots of private institutions have ways of solving collective action problems. If you set up a club, for example, you might create a common fund to which all members of the club have to pay a subscription. If somebody doesn't pay the subscription, you kick them out of the club. But you can hardly kick China out of the world if it decides not to abide by its agreements in relation to carbon emissions. So there's no effective way to enforce these international agreements in relation to things which actually might be quite sensible in for the international community to take action. And when you're talking about people such as countries which might invade Taiwan or countries which have invaded neighbouring Ukraine, you can't rely on goodwill. Ensure that their governments keep to the agreements. Now, one area which works slightly better in that respect is the World Trade Organization. Again, you have a similar phenomenon. Countries, it's normally beneficial for countries just to remove their trade barriers, whatever other countries do. Unilateral free trade is a good idea. New Zealand went down the path of unilateral free trade in the early 1990s and totally changed its growth path as a result. However, countries are often under pressure from their own electorates to put protectionist barriers in place to protect particular industries. And it's helpful for governments to join organizations where lots of governments all agree to remove trade barriers in relation to each other, as long as all the others do too. And then the governments can go back to the electorate and say, yeah, we're removing this trade barrier, but this other country is removing their trade barriers against our exports. And And the World Trade Organization is quite an effective organization for doing that. It operates by consensus. It operates from the bottom up. No country acts unless all other countries act. It actually does have an enforcement mechanism. It has a court. Unfortunately, President Trump stopped appointing the US members to the court, so the court's no longer working. And Joe Biden, despite all his rhetoric, is not behaving very differently from President Trump in this area, so the court is still not working, unfortunately. But in principle, it has an enforcement mechanism. And it has a limited and realistically achievable objective. It goes back to this idea of restraining governments from doing bad things rather than forcing them to do particular things. And I think the WTO has worked quite well in that respect. So, some more tentative conclusions before I move on to the short final bit. So, going back to the question of the United Nations and global governance in its proper understanding of the word. I think a global organization to protect human rights is appropriate, but it must be held to account, and the one we've got is not very effective. It could be better if its main paymasters held it to account. We can learn something from Friedrich Hayek's suggestion that as well as having the United Nations, and he accepted that the United Nations was a good thing, or the League of Nations at the time he was writing, we should have a further international organization with voluntary membership, the aim of which was to stop member governments from restricting its citizens from having basic freedoms to trade, migrate, and so on and so forth. In practice, I think I think on that basis, Hayek would have been in favor of the European Union in its early days, I should say. And in practice, we do have a sort of patchwork of those organizations, and the WTO is one of them. But it's really important that those organizations evolve from the bottom up. And that's where I have some messages. Apologies if this sounds patronizing coming from somebody from a non-member, but I have some messages for the European Union. So there are some good things about the European Union in terms of how I've described how I think international governance should work. Nobody is forced to be a member, and it is possible to leave. It is designed, in principle at least, to stop governments controlling citizens' natural freedoms. So it's designed to stop governments preventing people from migrating, either leaving or entering a country, rather like Victoria suggested. It stops governments controlling capital movements of its citizens and stops governments trading, again, rather like Victoria mentioned. And it started in a fairly good place, I think. And even the Single Market, which the Single Market Act was in 1986 and meant to be complete by 1992, this idea that we should remove all regulatory barriers to trade, that was a pretty good idea too, I think, because it originally was supposed to work. This was Margaret Thatcher's vision. It was her commissioner who invented the idea. Margaret Thatcher's vision was that each country should recognize each other's country's regulation, and on that basis we should just allow goods to flow through the European Union. But this wasn't good enough for the European Union bureaucracy, because incredibly rapidly what happened was that the European Union bureaucracy decided to centralize and harmonize regulation at the European Union level, as I mentioned with the insurance regulation example, Solvency II. And of course, the European Union bureaucracy is not really accountable to any European citizen. So you've got another one of these principal agent problems. So essentially, the European Union has become like a big country, but a big country which doesn't have a proper democratic mandate at all, or indeed any method of democratic constraint. What we could have had instead is harmonization, if only the bureaucracy of the European Union wasn't so set on centralization, uniformity, and harmonization. we could have had moves towards harmonization by evolution. So let me use the euro as the example. The British government proposed in about 1990 that the European Central Bank should issue euro as an independent entity, and then any country it wished could, citizens of any country in the European Union could use euro if they wished. Businesses could use euro, but individual countries could keep their own currencies. And then that could have evolved so that individual countries could have retired their currencies when they wished. Germans could have decided to get rid of the mark, the French get rid of the franc, and they could have done that in an evolutionary way. But no, again, it had to be imposed by abolishing all national currencies immediately and creating one single currency, top down, rather than allowing things to evolve from the bottom up. So I think really that's where the European Union has gone wrong in terms of my way of thinking about international governance, which is to allow things to evolve from the bottom up, to be accountable, to allow for regulatory competition, regulatory variety, and create institutions which are not captured by their bureaucracy. And very finally, I want to talk about something which is often forgotten in this discussion. We have some amazingly fine examples of international regulation which arise out of the market itself. They arises out of private associations. I've picked two examples here, but I could mention others. There are many related to sport. The Federation of International Football Associations, FIFA, UEFA. Much more important than that, the International Cricket Council, and several others. Also stock exchanges as well, which operate on an international basis. The two I mentioned here are professional bodies. So my own profession is the actuarial profession. The British actuarial profession regulates actuaries in about 50 countries, and those actuaries in those different countries take the professional exams and accept the regulatory authority of the UK actuarial profession. The Chartered Institute of Management Accountants, which is another British professional organisation, regulates management accountants more or less on a global basis. So the picture at the top there is a SEMA, qualified SEMA fellow in Pakistan. The one beneath there is, I think, somebody from Botswana. So you have regulatory institutions which come out of the market and civil society, which operate on an international basis and are subject to competition. If SEMA was a really bad regulator of accountants, then you could have competition from, say, American professional bodies instead. The International Swaps and Derivatives Association was more or less faultless during the financial crisis, despite the extent to which derivatives were involved in some of the underlying problems in the financial crisis. And its master agreement, as it's called, is used for literally trillions of dollars of derivatives transactions worldwide, and it uses English law, and it has its own disputes resolution mechanism, and the contracts are written in English law. Again, it's an international regulatory body which has arisen out of markets and civil society. So, finally, to conclude, some things have to be done top down and include all nations, but they should really be a minimal number of things, and really the countries which finance those bodies should really ensure that they stick to their knitting, just do the minimum necessary to pursue their legitimate functions. There are lots of regulatory institutions which proceed by consensus and evolve from the bottom up. Some of these have produced really good results. I'd say the World Trade Organization has, but some of them fail. You'd expect some to fail, but it's not a bad way of working. I would use the lessons from the top two conclusions to suggest that the EU should be reformed to work in a much more bottom-up and evolutionary way to prevent it effectively becoming a state which actually ends up undermining fundamental economic freedoms rather than enforcing them. But we should never forget, in considering this whole subject, how successful private and civil society organisations and associations are in regulating economic and social life. And they are successful because ultimately they are subject to competition. Nobody has to be a member of them. FIFA has had its problems with corruption and so on, but if FIFA was an absolutely terrible body, the World Football Association should create another competing federation. Indeed, that almost happened to UEFA a couple of years ago. So, that's it. Happy to open to discussion. Thanks.